Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? So welcome to another episode of the Athens and Jerusalem podcast. In this podcast, we have a new topic, and I know that Stephen and I don't, Cameron, I'm not sure of the topic, and I will tell you, it's prophets.
Oh.
And I was just checking a little bit about on the internet about prophets, and what I realize is that prophets are mostly or only in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, which means that, like in Hinduism, they have like gurus, but they are not understood as prophets. They're more like teachers. And in Buddhism, of course, Buddha was maybe a kind of prophets. But so I'm just thinking that we just start by our own connotations on this word.
Interesting.
Cameron, do you want to? Do you have any idea?
I just wanted to suggest, I remember a long time ago, we talked about the fact that in this new age of human development, we need to sort of redefine many key concepts, because if we think of them or use them in their traditional meaning, it would be limiting and even misleading. So I think we need, when you say prophet, like what is meant by a prophet? Because, for instance, even if you take the Christian and the Muslim context, they mean very differently. So Christians become, of course, very offended when Muslims says that Christ was a prophet. But for Muslims, this is a very high station, whereas in Christianity, it means like, it was something lesser, because they see Jesus as the Son of God, and then there were these lesser Judaic prophets. So I think that in this context, and then as you said, the term doesn't even appear in connection with the Indian or religions or Zoroastrian and so forth. So I think we need to define what is meant by prophets beyond its current usage. I guess somehow in English the connotation has something to do with someone who prophesizes, right? Can sort of tell the future, but I don't know whether. Because I think a phenomenon which is interesting is that there have been throughout times these so far only men that have claimed to have received divine revelation, and they have been the founders of great religions. So maybe we could look at these kind of figures and to see in what their claim has been, what they have done, what they're something along those lines.
Yeah, I think where the conversation goes is going to entirely be a function of how we define what a
Yeah,
prophet
that's right.
is in the in the sense of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. We think of a prophet as being, yeah, as you say, someone who claims to speak with the voice of God, whether in the station of God himself, as in the case of Jesus, or as a mouthpiece in the case of the prophets of the house of Israel, or of Muhammad. But the commonality even between those, even though there's a sort of difference of high, low station, are you God, aren't you God? The commonality is that there are words spoken which are said to be directed by God, delivered by God. There's a sense in which the prophet is a kind of a mouthpiece. And that contrasts with, do we even include the more Eastern conception of what you might call prophet more broadly, but yeah, they didn't say they were speaking on behalf of God. In the case of Buddha, he doesn't have a positive conception of God at all, as far as the historical record has preserved. And one can, I guess, with a little bit of a stretching of the term, include someone like Krishna into the category as, not the founder of Hinduism, because Hinduism is a far more complex thing than that, but as someone who in some way represents something similar to what Moses or Jesus or Muhammad represented. So if our aim is to try to find commonalities, then we'll try to land on a definition of prophet that is more all-encompassing and that's more inclusive of the great faith traditions of the world. And if our aim is otherwise, then we might restrict the definition of prophet, then that it then only includes a subset of those individuals. So what is the aim?
Yeah.
Maybe we should try to have like a broad understanding of what could this be? Could it be like, because of course Buddha didn't have a god, but maybe he had some divinity or something divine that he was connected to in his thoughts. And then we could discuss what is it? What is this kind of revelation, or
what do they have in common behind these definitions, or even behind what they say is regarded as whether their words are said to be divinely revealed or not. In the special case of Islam, there's a specific idea that the prophet is the one who reveals verses, and these verses are said to be given or delivered by God, maybe through the mouthpiece of an angel, and the verses themselves are the proof of the prophet. And I think that's somewhat adjacent to at least the way that, say, the Bible, the Old and the New Testaments have been received and understood in modern times. Okay, these are verses, they're set apart from verses produced by regular human beings. They contain truth that is of a different order than truths which may be conveyed by regular human beings. And so there's a sense of prophet which is connected in the West to, more generally, to this idea of a sacred book. In the East, you don't have the same concept of prophet. You also don't have the same concept, I think, of although as it's evolved, you have what their words, the words that have been recorded by them have also been gathered into books which are regarded as sacred books. And so there's a kind of equivalence between, say, the sutras or the Upanishads or something on the Eastern side, the Tao Te Ching and the Bible, the Quran on the more Western side of things. Even though to the followers of these respective traditions, their interpretation of who's the originator of these words and what the status of these words is may be different. I mean, in the case of of Buddhist writings, I was just glancing through the Diamond Sutra yesterday, and really amazing statements are made about how the truth that's being expressed is really beyond the words. You have to look beyond the words. So in a way, the words are just kind of a garment or clothing around something, or maybe a finger pointing at the moon, gesturing in the direction of something. And the real point of the thing is not the words at all. Whereas perhaps a little bit more in the Western tradition, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, the words are the thing. The words are, define certain structures, certain ways of being and living in the world, certain do's and don'ts, and those are said to be the thing that is God given. Whereas my sense of it is that these words of the prophets in the East are not taken in the same way. But maybe we can find like a common thread behind them. If our search, if our goal is to find sort of a broader unifying concept, then maybe we can identify some spark that lies behind all of these words and all of these conceptions of religion and prophets that everyone can sign on to and say, yes, we're all part of this one thing, even though it takes these different forms.
Yeah, and I personally also pretty much in the same vein. I think we may need to start from a sort of a very non-postmodern sort of grand theory perspective, and then like find the significance of the individual quote unquote prophets within the because I guess essentially the question becomes, okay, so let's say there have been these people who have claimed that they have some sort of a divine mission, and okay, you can look at this from a sort of a psychological or sociological perspective and say, well, they for some reason they had this kind of weird conception. Or then you can also, I mean, if you're trying to now bring Athens and Jerusalem together to see that could there be some sort of a rational explanation to why certain people have made this claim, and there could there be actually some sort of reality and truth behind such a claim, and if so, what would it be, and what is there some sort of an explanatory model that would explain how come there are more than one such person, and things like that, so to sort of find some sort of a idea pattern, something like that, logic in this phenomenon. And so one, I think one sort of a conceptual framework that has been offered is that to see this analogous to an educational system where you have different teachers and different sort of textbooks coming to students at their different stages of development, and although they teach different things, but there's also a coherence between them, and there's no qualitative difference, but the sort of the quantitative difference has to do with the fact that students develop throughout years. And we could say that, okay, humanity has also been like a developing class, and has required guidance or teachings that vary from time to time, something along those lines. But I mean, that's just as an example of the kind of explanatory framework that I think we would benefit from.
I think also that we have already mentioned maybe something that is in common. Stephen, for instance, was talking about truth, and I'm so sure that these humans have tried to express, like, they are truth tellers in one way or another, and even that they have this idea of what life is, what existence is, and trying to express this as something they have got from God or from existence or from the divine. I think that this is something that could be like one common position. And maybe they also have expressed, like preached wisdom in a way of this, what kind of life humans should have.
There's so many different frameworks we can use to try to explain it. Cami, you mentioned the classroom framework. You know, we can think of the prophets as like classroom teachers. There's like first, second, third, fourth grade. That has some advantages of it's a very easy to understand. It's a simple narrative. It gives some idea of there being progress over time, that we might want to look towards the later prophets rather than the earlier ones, presuming that there's been progress in the moral development of humanity. At the same time, it has disadvantages because it tends to undermine a bit the quest to find a kind of universal equivalence between religions and a kind of equal validation of all of them. Because then the early ones are, well, you're a more primitive religion and I'm a more advanced religion. Makes it harder to talk about religions as being fundamentally equal. Another way of thinking about another narrative framework, and I think all of these have advantages and disadvantages, is to think of prophets as a kind of leading edge, the far extreme leading edge of a process of evolution. So there's a through line in this, and this topic has come up before in our conversations. You know, if there's one thing that all of these prophets have in common, it's the idea that we're not just here randomly. The universe is not here randomly, and we're not just thrust into a world with no purpose, but there's some kind of purpose embedded in the world, which it is in some way our individual and collective responsibility to uncover and to align ourselves with. Now, how we define exactly what that purpose is, how we define what the source of that purpose is, varies extremely between cultures and between time periods. But there's I think, a commonality that there's an invisible, you know, not obvious dimension of reality that is nevertheless more important than the obvious dimension of reality. And for that perspective, we can think of prophets or gurus or whatever word we want to use for it as those who represent in any given time period the kind of leading edge of an evolutionary process which is aligned with this ultimate purpose of things, with the progress of the universe. On this planet, we can look at it as the unfolding of life and consciousness over time. That's kind of the through line that gives us a kind of directionality in what otherwise would be a very random universe. So the prophet then is not so much an assigned teacher, because then, you know, then that's a less organic way, I guess, of thinking about what a prophet is than thinking of them as maybe something that naturally appears in its season, you know, like the fruit appears on the tree at its season, and you could never really predict before it appears exactly at the tip of what branch this fruit appears. But once it does, it's a transformative event for the tree. It's a kind of fruition, literally, of the purpose of the tree, and things appear that just you couldn't have expected. If you'd never seen an apple tree before, and all you'd seen were the leaves and the branches, when an apple appears, I mean, it's an amazing thing, you know. It's nutritious and it's tastes great in it, you know, and wow, within it are the seeds of the continuance of the tree. You know, the immortality of the tree is contained in that apple, but you could never have predicted its appearance before the thing actually appeared. So there's a kind of magic to it, although it's not magic. It's in a way programmed in the universe itself that this thing would happen. Maybe that's another framework to think about what is a prophet and what are they doing in the world. You know, they're pulling us along in the direction of consciousness. They're pulling us along in the direction of opening our minds and hearts to that invisible breeze that runs through everything, that is our origin and our goal. And then everything else then becomes kind of detail, you know, whether this is structured around a particular god or triumvirate of gods or pantheon of gods or no particular god, you know, that becomes secondary to the more fundamental message, which is that that we're born into a purposeful universe, and we ought to align ourselves with that purpose to fulfill both our individual and collective potentialities.
And this kind of dynamics that you're referring to, Stephen, I think is supported by, I think, at least two things that all of these figures have in common. One is that their teachings or the concept that they have introduced have at some point led to the establishment of a new civilization. I think that we can see that all existing great civilizations have their sort of roots in one of these world religions. I mean, and also that each one of them, when they came, and or the kinds of message or the concepts that they introduced they were transformative, and thereby they were also very revolutionary in their own time, and that's why they all were met with um, great opposition from the especially the religious, but sometimes even from secular um, power holders of the time. So it was never that, a prophet came and said something and people went, oh, wow, yeah, like, this is what, in that sense, it wasn't like really an apple in the sense that, everybody's very happy when the apple comes, but it was like, what is this? The tree shouldn't have this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it took time before people realized, no, but actually this apple was a pretty good thing, So
Only in
so and
retrospect
that
we
yeah,
identify
and
these
that
prophets.
yeah, that makes us also. I've often thought that, like, because, well, I mean, the kind of things that these people have said, whether you look at the Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha, I mean, they have been very, very wise things. So you think that, okay, they couldn't have been totally stupid people. So they must have at least themselves really believed that they had a mission, because otherwise, this wasn't like the best way to become popular or rich or successful. It was basically a suicide mission. And so unless you really believe that this is what you should do, I don't think any half intelligent person would have, made a career choice. Let's become a prophet.
I think C.S. Lewis famously said there's really only three options when it comes to these claims.
Yeah.
Either they were deceitful, looking for power, followers,
Yeah.
or they were madmen, just,
Yeah.
crazy off their rockers, or they were telling the truth.
Yeah.
So take your
Exactly.
pick, but yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's a good fourth option. And
I think also that there is a very close connection between what they are saying and what they are doing. And
Beautiful.
this
Yeah. Yeah.
and this is also important, because if there, for instance, was madmen, I would guess that they would not have.
Exactly.
And also, maybe not, if they were interested in power, maybe they would have hidden, they would have
unless they played the game very well.
very well.
But I mean, knowing where it ends, I mean, Cammy's point is a great one. It's a suicide mission. If you're smart enough to create a religion, you're smart enough to know where this is going to end for you
Yeah.
personally.
Yeah.
And if you really don't believe in the transcendent claim you're making, why would you go through all of that
exactly.
personal pain and suffering?
Let's take the case of Jesus. I mean, if Jesus just wanted to become, I don't know, popular or influential, he could have just become another rabbi, right? He could have stayed within the Judaic framework and just become, an outstanding Jewish leader and have lots of following. The fact that he actually challenged that and claimed to be the Messiah, that was definitely not a very intelligent way in terms of if you're just after power and influence or even deceiving people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole concept of a prophet is just there's such a disenchantment with the idea of it in the modern secular age. The very thought that someone could truthfully speak from such a position, that it's possible for a person to have by virtue of some innate, birthright, have the ability to make pronouncements and claims about reality that everyone must submit to, that it seems that this idea that there's some kind of presumptive authority in the world, and it's our duty to identify and follow that presumptive authority, seems to run against the ethos of the Enlightenment and everything that follows, that there are no authorities in anything. Any authority is challengeable. Any truth claim can and ought to be challenged if we are collectively going to reach a greater truth. That seems to be the story of the Enlightenment in area after area. Prophets, of course, authorities of all kind, political authorities, scientific authorities, medical authorities, you name it. One by one, all of the authorities of the past, the presumptive authorities of the past, were overturned through this newly discovered method, the scientific method of, hey, let's actually investigate what the world is telling us rather than following the dictates of some authority from ancient times. And that has been so successful and has brought humanity to such a great forward leap of progress in so many areas, that the idea that a prophet could come in this time making the same kinds of claims as past prophets, saying, look, here are my verses, I'm from God, you must follow me. It's a tough sell. It's a tough sell if we think of prophets, I think, in the way that we thought of them in the past. And if we think of authority the way we thought of authority in the past. Somehow I think we're faced with a nearly impossible challenge of, if there is such a thing as prophets in the modern age, it has to somehow play nice with science and our let's say newly on the scene, a few centuries old, discovered superpower of how we now investigate reality by critically examining all claims to absolute authority and absolute truth. Any prophet of the modern era would have to, those claims would have to be submitted to the critical examination of everyone, and not simply accepted on the basis of an authority claim.
Well, I'm thinking if I should try to mention one who could be like a modern prophet, and this is, of course, it's but I have one name in my head that pops up, and that's Mahatma Gandhi.
Okay. All right.
Say more.
No, I don't know more, but it's like his anti-violence preach on how to create or to build a new world, a new way of being together. But it's, of course, it's not new. It is in many ways the same thoughts that have been presented several times through history. But this is my name. I don't know what you think of it.
Yeah. Well, if we include Gandhi, we should also include, particularly apropos for this week, Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
as a similar kind of prophet for the modern age, who spoke such moving words and was able to move multitudes to a broader vision of humanity, which I think is nearly universally recognized as the right way forward today, not at the time.
May I just go one little step backwards before we come back to this? Because I don't know if you're familiar with, there was I mean, I haven't read it in its original, but I've read parts of the translation. A couple of years ago, I sort of became aware of this book by the German philosopher Lessing. That is, the English translation is The Education of the Human Race. And there he sort of, his main arguments are that humanity develops gradually like a child growing into adulthood, and therefore God's revelations must be given in forms appropriate to each developmental stage. And he says that early revelations use sensory, concrete, and simple commands because humanity was not yet ready for abstract moral truths. And as humanity matures, divine teaching becomes more rational, universal, and moral. Now, you see, I know that you were saying, Stephen, and I can understand that, um, that one could then say that, okay, so one religion is, or one revelation is sort of more developed than the other. But I think that this is not question of, actually, I think it, the quality is the same, because the quality is not judged by the amount of content or the sophistication of content. It's judged by how appropriate it is for. I mean, I don't think that anybody would think that it would be great if somebody comes and starts talking about, I don't know, statistics to 5-year-olds
Mhm.
to show that, we're doing quality mathematics. So you probably will, put some
Yeah,
apples in front of them or something, whatever.
yeah.
And that is still good, preschool education.
Yeah. Undeniably, there's progress. I mean, at one point, an eye for an eye made perfect sense, and at another point, turn the other cheek makes more
Yeah.
sense on the level of personal morality, and and one can easily imagine earlier, more primitive times, just different modes of moral thinking being appropriate to those times. So I certainly don't mean to try to invalidate the classroom analogy entirely. That it's just that I guess, and this is my own metaphysical bias coming through, is that I I am personally more comfortable thinking about this subject as a bottom-up phenomenon than as a top-down phenomenon.
Hmm,
And
hmm, hmm.
perhaps this is I mean, maybe it's a false dichotomy, and I suspect in the end it is a false dichotomy. But as with all of these things, it may be useful to a point to at least frame what we're talking about. Do we
Right.
think of a prophet as someone who is receiving a message from on high, so to speak, um, and following an instruction manual that's delivered and then brought into the world, or do we think the prophet is an incarnation, a divine incarnation of God himself, God herself, um, or, and maybe it's a false or, do we think of a prophet as like the fruit on a tree? It's something that is a in a way a natural occurrence, no less magical for being a natural occurrence, no less unexpected, and no less, exciting and transformative and everything that a prophet is. But is it something which is which can be explained within a kind of evolutionary framework of the cosmos that doesn't require a kind of divine interposition from another realm that disrupts the causal structure. And I guess behind all of that, if I really show my hand, it's the it, it's a question of how does the world work?
Mm,
How does the world actually work? Does it work according to a set of laws and relationships? We would call them the laws of nature that are continuous and that are capable of generating all of the complexity that we
mm,
observe? Or is there some incompleteness to the laws of nature that requires or invites some sort of periodic interposition from some other causal framework at certain points in time? And for me, that way of thinking about how the world works is less convincing. It's just more complicated. It just seems more arbitrary, and again, if my own bias, if I imagine if I was the creator of the world, I would, and if I was an infinitely powerful creator and infinitely wise, I would create a world which doesn't require me to sort of rewind the clock every few days to keep it running. It wouldn't require sort of periodic interventions of myself into that world to get the thing done that I want to get done. If I was a really great creator, I would create a world that was so perfect and complete in itself that it would be able to generate on its own. It wouldn't need the rewinding. It wouldn't need me to interpose.
mm.
But I understand that's not a problem for a great many people. Probably for the majority of the people, it's not a problem to think about the world in this other way. That there's an invisible dimension of reality which is actually causal. Which if you had the ability to observe it at that moment, you would detect some energy has entered into the equation that wasn't there before. But I guess the issue I have with that is that as far as scientists and particularly physicists have been able to discover, the world has what we would call causal closure. You know, as we might to detect other forces, you know, other kinds of energies or something which might have a causal influence in the world, we can't find anything beyond those particles and forces that we've cataloged. All of this, of course, comes with a huge caveat that there are big unknowns. You know, how does the universe come into being in the first place? What about dark matter and dark energy and these other big questions that show that there's still great incompleteness in our understanding of things. But at least when it comes to the micro level, when it comes to something that you can observe in a laboratory at a human scale, there just doesn't seem to be space for there to be other forces at work beyond the ones that we already know and understand quite well. And extrapolating that to the question of, well, what about prophets? So is a prophet a kind of interposition, you know, into the world from another dimension in a quite literal scientific sense? Or can we understand it in a more organic sense as something which is continuous and organic in the world and something which arises in a natural sense where nature is taken as a sort of capital N nature? And I guess behind that as well is, well, is your philosophical position on all of this one of dualism or one of monism? And monism to me just seems simpler than dualism. I mean, if you're going to have a dualistic ontology, if you're going to believe that there's really two kinds of stuff, well, why stop at two? Why not make it 3 or 17 or whatever? There's a kind of arbitrariness, which I hasten to say, I mean, 2 is actually not that arbitrary. You know, yin and yang and substance and form and male and female, and there seems to be a kind of naturalness to a duality which is not present in, say, 5 or 7 or 3. But 1 is more simple still. You know, a single world in which we think of what we think of as the supernatural dimension and the natural dimension are actually just different aspects of one thing. And what we call it supernatural, a prophet, a guru, whatever, is a matter of human perspective, and not viewed from the perspective of eternity. It's all one thing. I think that was kind of Spinoza's insight about seeing everything through the eye or through the perspective of eternity. And you see, there's really just one thing. There's one substance. It's all God in a way. That's why they called Spinoza a God-intoxicated man, and others called him an atheist because they didn't understand what he was trying to say.
Right.
But he was taken with this idea of understanding everything, including religious phenomena, within a single framework without having to divide it into multiple causal frameworks.
I mean, listening to you, I mean, I started reflecting on the fact that, okay, so you know, you, Stephen, are obviously one person. You know, you're not many phenomena. You're one person, and as you're talking, I mean, the words that you're saying, the thoughts that you're sort of sharing with us, they are part of you. They're, you know, they're you talking, but yet, I mean, your words, they are you, but they are also something that emanate from you, as it were. So in that sense, I mean, there is monism, but there is also, in a sense, a dualism that you know, even when you are not able to, in a situation where you wouldn't be able to say those words, you still would be you.
That's the exact analogy used in the Bible. You know, the logos is the word. And
Yeah.
in the beginning was the word. The word emanates from the speaker. You know,
Yeah.
the world is the speech of the creator.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
not just Christianity. That goes back to the very first bits of philosophy we have for the ancient Greeks. You know, the first fragment we have from Heraclitus, I think, refers to the logos. There's an ordering principle. There's a word. There's a language of reality, which is somehow emanating from the one, which is not the one, but at the same time it is the one.
Yeah.
Just like the rays of the sun. They're not the sun, but at the same time, they wouldn't be there without the sun, and they're coterminous with the sun in a way. They're there along with the sun, inseparably. And speech is a similar kind of a thing.
So could these prophets be seen like speech acts by the divine?
Absolutely, they're the word made flesh.
Yeah, yeah.
And I also
So
thought that, yeah, sorry.
no, sure. No, go ahead. No.
No, but I also thought that maybe this about being great speakers are also something that is connected to this, that they have this exceptional way of expressing themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and
It's
there's,
a superpower.
yeah, it's, I mean, I think all of these figures that we may, by some definition, call prophets, at least those who have been the founders of major world religions, have come with new kind of words and concepts, each of them. And the other thing which is interesting about their language is that there's been a creative power in what they have said. In other words, as I said, they have said something, they've claimed something to be true, and at the time it has been very revolutionary. But then we see that that actually did become a reality. I mean, a whole civilization sort of was built upon these new concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So you were like referring now to the turning of the cheek concept. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, even something as maybe basic as hospitals were, a creation that came out of that concept. So there's, I mean, there's something that one could call maybe a creative power in the words of some people. Well, who was it that said that? Like there are many commands given in the world, but some of them actually become reality and others don't. So, I can say something, let there be peace, and it may
I think
never
that's
happen, but
a beautiful answer to the question of, how would we evaluate the claim of a prophet in the modern day?
yeah.
If someone comes and says, "Okay, I'm a prophet," and you say, "Okay, prove it to me." So
Mm,
what's the proof of the prophet? They say, "Well, I have these verses." Okay,
mm,
well, a lot of people produce words
mm,
spontaneously that seem moving or profound or deep. I mean, there are multiple sages and gurus with, multiple millions of words that they've generated over the course of their teachings. So the quantity of words is certainly not a great litmus test. It would have to be something along the lines of what you were saying. Do these words have power
mm,
to do what? To transform,
mm,
to create, to change our perspective from something to something else. And it has to be able to do that both individually and collectively. It has to change and transform individuals so that they reorient their lives around these words in some way. And it has to change us collectively. It has to generate a new way, a new mode of social organization, not if not a new kind of governance system, then a new way of relating to one's neighbor. And turn
yeah.
the other cheek is a perfect example of that. Love thy
Mm,
neighbor.
mm,
The concept of love is ancient, but that specific turning the other cheek seems to be a good example of something new that comes that's
mm.
productive of that induces a kind of transformation or a phase transition in
Yeah.
society. That would be the proof of it. But that proof works in retrospect. There's a difficult nut to
Yeah,
crack
yeah,
here.
yeah,
What
exactly.
if
Yeah, the
you're right on
formats.
the scene?
Yeah,
Suppose you're
exactly.
on the scene and a new prophet comes and says, "I'm the prophet." And you're like, "Okay, prove it." And the prophet is like, "Okay, here are the words, here are the verses." And you're like, "Okay, those are amazing. Those are great. You've produced them in a way that I couldn't produce. but you don't have anything to judge them
Yeah,
on yet. You
exactly.
can't say, oh, look what it has produced. Look at the people who have been transformed by it. Look at the lives sacrificed selflessly for for these principles. Look at the great temples or churches that have been reared in its name. You have none of that. All you have is someone making a claim and some words.
Yeah. But just
It's
before we go into to that, I mean, it's just a small further reflection on what you just said, that, like if you compare, let's say, the words of Jesus, and I mention this because probably most of our listeners are best familiar with those, and let's say you compare them with the writings of Immanuel Kant. I mean, quite obviously, Immanuel Kant's writings have greater seeming sophistication, right? They're much more detailed, much more analytical, the whole sort of thought structure, and it's very clever, and sounds like it's true. And there's very good reason to think that almost everything he has written, I mean, Kant has written, has been true and very wise. But yet, as you were pointing out, I mean, there's no great sort of change or transformation that has happened in the world as a result of his writings. I mean, it has definitely helped many people understand things in a new way, but it's not like we can say, okay, Germany became a different country because of Kant's ideas.
Yeah, you could say who's given their life for Kant,
exactly, or yeah, exactly,
let themselves be thrown to the lions for the words of Jesus. How many people?
Yeah, exactly. So Jesus, with a rather simple philosophical structure and with no known educational background, had a completely different sort of class of impact on humanity. So I think that's quite interesting.
I'll briefly play the devil's advocate, although I agree with you. But one rebuttal to that would be, well, you can't measure the influence of Kant in the same way that you measure the influence of the words of Jesus. It's not measured in lives sacrificed. It's measured in a more subtle way of how the history of ideas evolves. And when it comes to Kant, the history of ideas definitely was deeply affected by the ideas of Kant, particularly his idea about things in themselves, and how the framework of language is intrinsically incapable of capturing those truths of the things in themselves. Everything we can say, everything we think, our very thoughts are structured by experience, which is one level removed from whatever reality might be. And well, that has a huge influence on and has had a major influence on the history of thought. In one way, it's made room for something which otherwise room would not have been made for. Kant made room for God. If you're a believer in God, room has been made for that. Whereas without Kant, one can easily imagine the progress of the history of ideas in which all of reality is on the surface and can be correctly described by language. And Kant was so persuasive in making the case that we do not have access to ultimate reality. And it's hard to measure the impact of that, but perhaps the impact of that was in its own way, on some kind of par with the impact of prophets. That would be the counter argument.
I think also if we should just elaborate a little bit more on Kant, I would also say that his understanding of human as a moral person and with autonomy, I think that has had huge impact on our the laws and how we are understanding a just society, because it gives human the possibility of acting morally without having laws.
Yes, the idea.
Yeah, but hold on a second. I would like, if I may, to actually challenge that, because I think, like I remember back in the early 90s, there was a there was an editorial in the leading Swedish newspaper, and it said something to the effect that Christianity today lives in the Social Democratic Party, not in the Swedish church. Because actually, if you look at the principles of social democracy in Sweden at that time, they were very much like, fundamental Judeo-Christian philosophy put into the framework of a welfare state. So I think that although Kant may have been able to analyze some of these dynamics and mechanisms, how they work, but I think it wasn't due to his explanation that we started building morally supported social structures. I think those would have happened based on our Judeo-Christian background here in the West. And I think the reason why they are now, in many cases, sort of crumbling down is because that moral foundation and that moral conviction doesn't exist anymore, and materialism and individualism have taken over, regardless of whatever Kant has explained. So
It's harder to draw the line between Kant's philosophy and something tangible in the world, but I agree.
Yeah, no, of course, there's not a huge difference between the categorical imperative of Kant and the golden rule in Christianity.
yeah.
But there's like this small distinction, and that is that in the golden rules, you should use yourself as a subject, as the measurement of what you are to do. But in Kant's perspective, you should think as how anyone would have done, like an objective perspective more than a subjective perspective on as the measurement of what you're to do. But this is not a huge difference if we understand the subject as actually something that is common in all human.
Yeah.
Anyway, so my point maybe is that we can see, looking at history, that there have been a few individuals throughout the centuries and millennia that have had a tremendous influence on the development of humanity and then human civilization, quite out of proportion with any sort of initial credits that they had. I mean, because it hasn't been based on the fact that they were very rich, very powerful, very educated, or anything like that. And that to me is just a interesting, intriguing phenomenon,
Although it cuts both ways. I mean, the great man theory of history applies to prophets just as well as it does to Alexander the Great or Hitler or Napoleon. I mean, a single individual can have, of course, an enormous impact on world history, but in either direction.
Yeah.
But I think in many things of what we have been discussing, we are ending up in this question: could there be any prophets in our society today? Is it possible, or have we made systems like is science in itself a kind of prophetic system? Is social science and understanding of democracy and these ideas, this kind of prophetic systems? What have you ended up?
Well, what about words? I mean, words being the signature of the prophet, divine verses, at least in the case of certainly a case of Islam and to a lesser extent in other religions. Now words are being generated by computers that on the whole are better than the words that humans are generating on many dimensions. They're crisper, they have more clarity, they sum up ideas with more economy. Maybe we would say, well, they're not equal to the moving verses of the Bible or the incredible insights into the human condition that you find in Shakespeare and other great works of literature. They're not reaching that level. Will they ever reach that level? I think it's still an open question. We'd like to plant a stake on our humanity and defend that ground and say, AI generated words are never going to intrude upon this territory, of the best human words. But I think the jury is still out on that. And if it's the case that in our lifetimes or at some point in the near future, words generated by machine become as moving to us, as meaningful to us as words that we read in sacred texts, then what becomes of our idea of the prophet? What becomes of our idea of divinely revealed religions when what we thought was the sole province of humanity, the sacred verses, becomes something which is indistinguishable from verses that are not generated by humans? I think that we're in nobody knows where this is going, and it's all happening so fast that we haven't had time to really think about the implications of it. But I think our humanity's encounter with words, how we think about words, is going through a radical transformation, and most of us are still in denial about it.
Yeah. But this is sort of what I meant, because I think Kant's words are. I mean, I'm actually a great admirer of Kant. I mean, I really love him, I could say. So this is not to belittle Kant. It's actually quite the contrary. But I mean, I think generally the Enlightenment idea was that somehow human rationality and AI being an extension of that could sort of take over the development of humanity. But I think there's in what has happened since the Enlightenment and the two world wars, I think there is very little to show, to me at least empirically, that wise words in themselves just are sufficient. And then this is I'm trying to see that I'm trying to I think figure out that like what is you use this word, Stephen, magic. Like, what's the magic in the words or the thoughts of, or the influence of these, what we might call prophets, that they have had such an influence on humanity?
They transform and they translate into action.
Yeah.
I think that's the answer. And that's ultimately, I guess, what would distinguish machine generated words from the words of Jesus. One of them actually makes us change our behavior in tangible ways, and not towards selfishness, but towards the opposite of that, towards a wider vision, a wider embrace.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be both. It has to be the words themselves are, and maybe never have really been a true litmus test. You can't just say, well, here are my verses. It has to be, here are the verses, and what are they doing? Mm-hmm. How are they affecting you? And beyond that, how are they generating something, a community that is tangibly different from communities that came before? I think it's possible to have a prophet in the modern age in that sense. I can't see us going back and thinking about it the way we thought about prophets in the past. In light of everything we've learned about the universe over the last few hundred years, it's hard for me to imagine how we can return to older ways of thinking about a prophet as a divine mouthpiece, for example. Although maybe as always, I'm speaking from my own set of biases and my own positionality on this, but which is maybe why whatever, if a modern prophet appears, their words have to be interpreted through multiple frameworks, because not every person among the 8 billion people on this planet are going to interpret those words and read out those words through the same kind of interpretive lens. Some
Mhm.
people will read them out through the traditional lens of, oh, God has come again, and here's the message, and here's the book. Maybe the majority of people will continue to read it out in that way. And maybe a minority will read it out through a more kind of organic metaphor of evolving consciousness and and inspired words being seen within that framework. For those of us who are no longer capable of or no longer feel comfortable with these older um, top-down frameworks of thinking about this phenomenon. But as long as in both cases the words produce transformation and produce
Mhm.
tangible results, who are we to argue, which is the right lens to see it through?
Yeah.
If the proof is in the pudding, if
Yeah.
the proof of these words being reality is what kind of a person is it producing, and whether that person in their own mind is thinking these words are revealed by God Himself and speaking to me, or whether you think of it more as this is an inspired person who's the leading edge of the evolution of consciousness. In either case, if it's producing a better person, then that's ultimately I think the litmus test.
And, and and I don't know if this is, I mean, you would be able to say, because you're the physicist, but, and as Tom commented, and I mean, I don't know if this would be, in any way a functional analogy in this case, but if you think of the phenomenon of magnetism, if you think of two, uh, let's say, pieces of metal, one of which is magnetic and the other one isn't, I mean, essentially, their constitutive molecules are the same. It's just that, as I understand it, in a magnetic piece, their orientation is different. Anyway, so it's not like they're completely of different substance. It's just that one of them has a magnetic
Mm.
effect and the other one doesn't.
Mm.
And could this be sort of the difference between wise words, some of which have that transformative effect and the others don't?
That's a great way of thinking about it, because when the atoms are aligned, their spins are aligned in the way that they have to be in a magnetic substance or
Yeah.
ferromagnetic substance, then it produces a quite unexpected and somewhat magical effect. Suddenly has this
Yeah.
long range force that can can affect other objects at a great distance away relative to the object itself. And who, not knowing about the phenomenon of magnetism, who could have ever predicted that this thing would be possible?
Mm.
And but as with magnetism, when it was first discovered, it was just kind of these magic stones that were useful
Yeah.
for navigation and things like that. It was hundreds of years until it was realized that, oh, this isn't some magic property of the stone, but it's a phenomenon which can be incorporated into a larger picture of how the world works, which includes electrical charge. And you then unite electricity and magnetism, and then lo and behold, you realize, oh, if we bring electricity and magnetism together and run through the equations, you get light. Light itself becomes a phenomenon so all of optics then comes into the circumference of our understanding of things which seem to be these magical properties of matter separately. But as we understand them better, we realize, oh, it's a beautiful synchronicity of causes and effects in this beautiful symmetric structured way. That's divine in its own way. And we can say, well, we've demystified the world by taking the magic out, and now it's just these cold, heartless equations. Or you can say these are amazingly beautiful things. These are, if anything, this is evidence of consciousness of a kind. Not necessarily an external, puppeteer kind of consciousness, but maybe an internal consciousness. But something I see it as something that has sacred valence. The For some it's a desacralization of the world to take these magical properties out of things and to put them into equations. But for those who really see the beauty and power of these equations, I see it as a sacralization.
Mm.
I think that's part of the, just to bring in one of my favorite people. I think that's what Carl Sagan was wonderful at doing, who brings the cosmos down to earth and does it in the tones of and using the language of the sacred. For him, the universe was a sacred thing. He didn't, use the word God or religion, and for him personally, these are not relevant things or even counterproductive things for his vision of the universe. But I see his way of seeing the cosmos as truly a kind of a sacred thing, more broadly defined.
I think maybe there should be like the ending words in this episode, because I think also, if I'm trying to sum up, in a way, we are trying to say that in the modern world we have science, we have social science and democracy, and we have AI, but I still believe that there are room and there are many people that still feels that something is missing, something that there's a dimension in existence that they still, maybe it's dualism, I don't know, but there are some people who are magnets oriented towards a different kind of existence. And then, of course, it's this dimension of reality that these prophets are giving us some kind of direction towards, that the other one does not have. So maybe that could be like the last words. Still trying to believe that maybe there could be prophets in our time too.
Beautiful. And
I
I think what is beautiful about these conversations that we have at these different sessions is that we are not trying to come up with some sort of final answers, but rather to bring up more questions and sort of multiple perspectives to things that are often seen in very sort of set ways. So I think that this has been, to me anyway, a very enriching way of looking at the phenomenon of prophethood from many different angles that are not usually thought about.
Yeah, I agree, Cameron, and I hope the listeners also have had the same experience that we have when we are talking together. So thank you for listening to this episode of Athens and Jerusalem.
You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.